Oil just dropped 13% in a single day. Brent crude went from above $113 this morning to below $100 per barrel. And the Bank of Canada's April 29th rate decision just got a whole lot easier. I want to walk you through why this one day in markets might be one of the most politically consequential days of Mark Carney's entire government. Because here is what happened, and here is what it means. Let me take you back to just 5 days ago, March 18th. The Bank of Canada is standing at a microphone in Ottawa, and Governor Tiff Malam looks like a man caught between a rock and a very hard place. The Canadian economy shed 84,000 jobs in February. GDP contracted 0.6% in the fourth quarter of 2025. And now, on top of a weak economy and U.S. tariff pressure, global oil prices have exploded past $100 a barrel because of the war in the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil and gas flows, is effectively closed. And M. Lam is standing there telling Canadians that when the March inflation data comes in, it is going to be higher. He used the word dilemma more than once. If he raises rates to fight inflation, he crushes an already weakened economy. If he cuts to support growth, he lets inflation run. Every economist in the country was staring at April 29th with something between dread and genuine uncertainty. And then this happened. Today, Monday, March 23rd, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that the United States and Iran have had, in his words, very good and productive conversations about a complete and total resolution of hostilities in the Middle East. He announced a 5-day pause on military strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure. Oil markets did not wait for a second opinion. Brent crude, which had been trading above $113 this morning and hit $119.50 at its peak just last week, plunged as much as 13%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had been pointing to further losses before Trump's post, surged more than 1,000 points by mid-morning. U.S. stocks had their best day since well before the war began. But here's where it gets complicated. Iran denied the whole thing. Iranian state media said there are no talks, no negotiations, no dialogue between Tehran and Washington. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said it would keep the Strait of Hormuz closed indefinitely and respond in kind to any attacks on its power plants. So you have a sitting U.S. president announcing a diplomatic breakthrough and the other party in that supposed breakthrough saying it never happened. Markets took a moment, retreated slightly when Tehran's denial hit the wires, then resumed gains when Trump told reporters Iran was the first to make contact and a deal could come within days. If you are a central banker trying to set monetary policy for the next 40 days, this is not exactly the clarity you were hoping for. But let's talk about what even a partial, temporary, contested de-escalation means for Canada specifically, because this is where the story gets genuinely interesting and genuinely consequential for real people paying for gas and groceries right now. Here's the exact problem Tiff Malam was describing 5 days ago. CPI inflation had eased to 1.8% in February, below the Bank of Canada's 2% target. Core inflation measures were close to 2%. Before the war started on February 28th, the inflation picture in Canada was actually pretty clean. The bank had cut rates 9 times since June 2024, bringing the policy rate down from 5% to 2.25%. The economy was adjusting. Things were not great, but they were manageable. Then the war hit. Oil prices surged, and MLM stood at that podium and said, and I am quoting here, that the March CPI report is going to show inflation going up. He was already telling Canadians to expect higher numbers. The Bank of Canada's January forecast assumed oil would be $60 US a barrel over their projection horizon. As of last week, it was hovering around $100. That is not a rounding error. That is a fundamentally different inflationary environment. But here's what nobody was talking about this morning. If oil prices stay near or below $100 through the end of March and into April, the March CPI data that MLM said would show inflation rising might actually come in softer than feared. Not necessarily soft, but softer. And that changes everything about what the Bank of Canada can or cannot do on April 29th. The bond markets are already pricing a very high probability of a hold at 2.25% in April, with only a 2% chance of a hike. That probability profile looks a lot more comfortable today than it did last Thursday when Brent was above $112. Wait, it gets worse for the people who were hoping Canada would be forced into a rate hike. Mark Carney has 3 by-elections on April 13th, 3 ridings in Toronto and Quebec that could give his Liberal minority government a razor-thin majority in the House of Commons. The Liberals currently hold 169 seats. They need 172 for a majority. If they sweep all 3, they get there. Though even at 172, the math remains hands tight because the Speaker is a Liberal MP. The key point here is this. Those by-elections happened 21 days before the Bank of Canada's rate decision, and voters in those ridings are going to be filling up their gas tanks in the days leading up to April 13th. Gas prices in the United States had risen for 23 consecutive days, reaching an average of $3.96 per gallon, according to ADLA, as of Monday, the highest price since August 2022. The average was up more than 30% in a single month, a bigger spike than in the wake of Hurricane Katrina or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In Canada, the dynamics are similar because oil is priced in a global commodity market. Higher crude means higher pump prices for Canadians, regardless of whether the conflict is happening on the other side of the world. Anger at the gas pump is one of the fastest ways to move political numbers. And Carney's Liberals were already navigating a complex political environment with tariff pressure from the United States, a weak labor market, and housing costs that are not going down. So what does falling oil mean for April 13? It means voters might experience actual relief at the pump before they cast their ballots. It means one of the sharpest consumer pain points in recent memory could be softening at exactly the right moment for the governing party. And that is not a coincidence you can entirely explain away as luck. Let me tell you why. There is a version of this story that says Carney got lucky. Oil just happened to drop at a politically convenient moment because of something Trump said on Truth Social. Chalk it up to geopolitical randomness. But I think that version of the story is incomplete. And here is why. Canada has been punching above its weight in the diplomatic response to this crisis. Foreign Affairs Minister Anand has been working the G7 circuit. Canada was one of 32 member countries that agreed to the International Energy Airways emergency oil release, the largest coordinated stockpile release in history, 400 million barrels. And crucially, on March 13th, when Trump announced a 30-day waiver on Russian oil sanctions to try to ease energy prices, Carney stood up in front of cameras in Norway alongside German and Norwegian leaders and said Canada was maintaining its sanctions on Russia, including on the Shadow Fleet. That is not a small statement. That is Canada explicitly pushing back on a U.S. decision while simultaneously standing with European allies on the broader geopolitical framework of the Iran war. The G7 finance ministers held an emergency virtual meeting on the day oil first crossed $100 a barrel, and they issued a joint statement saying they stood ready to take necessary measures, including supporting global energy supply. Canada is in that room. Canada is part of that coordination. And when Trump came out Monday morning and announced a diplomatic pause, it happened in a context where allied pressure, public market pain, and G7 coordination had been building for weeks. You cannot cleanly separate the diplomatic environment from the market outcome. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture, the 5-day clock. Trump did not announce a permanent pause. He announced a 5-day postponement of strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure. That means by Saturday, March 28th, this window either extends or it does not. And if it does not, if the Iran talks collapse, if Iran continues to deny that any talks are taking place, if the IRGC decides to escalate, the oil price relief that markets are celebrating today reverses, and it could reverse hard. Goldman Sachs, writing before Trump's Monday announcement, was forecasting Brent to average $110 in March and April, and if the Strait of Hormuz stayed at 5% of normal flows through April 10th, they expected prices to trend higher. The IEA executive director described the current situation in the Middle East as very severe and worse than both oil shocks of the 1970s and the Russian invasion of Ukraine combined in terms of supply disruption. Here is what nobody is talking about. The Iranian denial matters a lot, not because it necessarily means there are no back-channel communications happening. Those things often happen below the public diplomatic surface. But because if Thrawn does not confirm any form of dialogue, the 5-day window becomes extremely fragile. Trump can say talks are productive. Iran can say there are no talks. And the market, which is already partially priced in de-escalation, gets caught in the middle. We saw a preview of this today. When Iran's denial hit, oil gave back some of its losses before resuming declines when Trump pushed back. That volatility pattern is going to define the next 5 to 10 trading days. And every tick up in crude between now and April 13 is a tick in the wrong direction for Carney's by-election calculus. There is also the structural issue that oil prices, even after today's drop, are still trading around 30 to 50% above where they were before the war started on February 28th. The price remains well above pre-war levels, even after today's significant decline. CNN, the relief is real. The underlying vulnerability is also real. Let me put all of this together for you because I think the full picture is more complicated than either Carney got lucky or Carney engineered this. What we actually have is a narrow, fragile, politically significant window. Oil prices dropped sharply today. The Dow recovered strongly. Markets got a dose of relief after weeks of extraordinary pain. And the Bank of Canada's April 29th decision, which was being shadowed by the genuine possibility of a forced rate hike into a weakening economy, now looks considerably more manageable. A hold at 2.25%, which was already the base case, looks more defensible today than it did last Thursday. For Carney specifically, the convergence of factors is striking. The March CPI data, which MLAM already pre-signaled would be elevated, will reflect prices from before today's drop. That data comes out in mid-April, right around the time of the by-elections. So there is a scenario where the March CPI headline is higher due to the initial war oil spike, creating some negative coverage right around April 13. That is the risk. The positive scenario, which today's oil move makes more likely, is that by the time April 29th arrives, the energy price trajectory has stabilized or improved enough that MLM can hold rates comfortably without looking like he is ignoring inflation. And here's the part that kept me up last night. The political fragility of Carney's government is not separate from this economic story. It is the context that makes every single data point, every single headline, and every single market move more consequential than it would be in a normal governing environment. He is running a minority government that is one defection, one unexpected by-election loss, one parliamentary procedural fight away from potential instability. The Terrebonne riding in Quebec, which the Liberals won by literally one vote in the last election before the Supreme Court nullified the result, is a genuine toss-up between the Liberals and the Bloc Québécois. Pollster Frank Graves is saying the Liberals could win all three on April 13th, and current national polling has them 16 points ahead of the Conservatives. But those polling numbers were built during a period when Carney was the new face, the Trump-resistant, economically credentialed alternative. Sustained economic pain from higher energy prices and continued job losses could eat into that lead faster than most people expect. The 5-day window is therefore not just a market story. It is a monetary policy story. It is a political story. And it is a story about whether the diplomatic architecture that Canada has been building over the past 3 weeks, the G7 coordination, the IEA emergency stockpile release, the principled and public stance on Russian oil sanctions actually contributed to creating the conditions in which a de-escalation became possible at all. That is a harder question to answer with certainty, but it is absolutely the right question to be asking right now. But that's not even the real story. The real story is what this moment reveals about how fragile the Canadian economic recovery actually is. The Bank of Canada had cut rates 9 times since June 2024. The policy rate came down from 5% all the way to 2.25. That was an enormous amount of monetary support injected into the system over roughly 18 months. And yet, when the Iran war hit on February 28th and oil spiked, the conversation immediately shifted to whether the bank might have to hike. That is not the behavior of an economy that is standing on solid footing. That is the behavior of an economy that is still deeply sensitive to external shocks, still carrying elevated household debt, still dealing with a housing market that the bank's own senior deputy governor said needs to see prices come down, and still absorbing the friction of U.S. tariff pressure on the most trade-exposed sectors. Here's what nobody's talking about. Even if oil stays below $100 for the next 6 weeks, the underlying vulnerabilities do not disappear. The Canadian unemployment rate rose to 6.7% in February. GDP contracted in the fourth quarter of 2025. Early 2026 data suggests the economy is expanding again, but at a pace below what the Bank of Canada had forecast in January. Add to that the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement Review, which MLM himself described as a major unknown with outcomes that could significantly reshape Canada's trade relationship with its largest partner. And you have a picture of an economy that is navigating multiple serious structural pressures simultaneously. The oil drop today gives Carney and MLM breathing room. It does not give them a clean runway. The next 5 days will tell us a great deal. If Trump and Iran reach even a preliminary framework agreement, if the Strait of Hormuz begins to reopen in any meaningful way, the IEA and Goldman Sachs projections that had Brent crude staying above $100 through April start to look wrong in the right direction. The Goldman base case before today's drop had Brent averaging $110 in March and April. If that forecast gets revised downward significantly, the March CPI overshoot that MLM already pre-announced becomes a data point the bank can look through rather than respond to. That is the scenario Carney needs. That is the scenario his by-election candidates in Scarborough, Southwest University, Rosedale, and Terrebonne need. Voters who felt the spike at the pump for 3 to 4 weeks and who are now watching prices come back down before April 13th are voters who have a very specific lived experience of this crisis. Whether they credit the government for the relief, blame the government for the initial pain, or conclude it was entirely out of anyone's hands is the political question that will define the next month. What happens next matters enormously. If Trump and Iran do reach some form of agreement, even a partial one, even a face-saving framework that allows the Strait of Hormuz to gradually reopen, the economic picture for Canada changes in a fundamental way. The Bank of Canada would have room not just to hold, but potentially to consider cuts by year-end, as some analysts were already suggesting before the war escalation intensified. The housing market, which has been weakening, could stabilize. Consumer confidence, which has been hammered by 3 straight weeks of rising gas prices, layoffs, and trade uncertainty, could begin to recover. That is a very different Canada heading into the summer than the one MLM was describing from that podium 5 days ago. If the talks collapse and oil goes back above $110, Carney faces a very different April. The by-elections become harder. The Bank of Canada's dilemma returns in full force. And the question of whether Canada can sustain its current political alignment under prolonged economic stress becomes much more urgent and much more public. I will leave you with this. What we saw today was not a guaranteed outcome. It was one day in a situation that remains profoundly uncertain. Trump himself has contradicted his own statements within 24-hour periods throughout this crisis. Iran is actively denying that what Trump described even happened. 5 days is not a resolution. It is a pause. And in global energy markets, in central banking, and in electoral politics, a pause that expires at the wrong moment can sometimes be worse than no pause at all. So I am genuinely curious where you think this goes. If Iran and the United States reach a real deal in the next 5 days and the Strait starts reopening, does that fundamentally change how you see Carney's political position heading into the summer? Or is the underlying economic damage already too deep for one fortunate oil drop to fix? Am I the only one watching this 5-day clock like it is the most important countdown in Canadian politics right now? Let me know in the comments. I read every single